Hello, and welcome to another episode of Rule of Carnage, a series of conversations, videos, podcasts, things of that nature, where myself, Glenn Ford, as it says there, talks to this guy, Mike Hutchinson. It says over there, I can never remember which side of me you're on. Um,
Honestly, it's a shock every time I look at it on YouTube. I never know which side it's going to come out.
we talk about designing better miniatures games. So what I want to talk about today is a potentially sort of, I think, well, it's at least a tricky enough subject that this is our second bite of the cherry in trying to have this conversation, which is the social contract within games. And I think part of why we're taking a second run at it today, you'll never see the first run of it. It's going to get dumped into a digital bin. Is that people can get quite sort of excised about some of the issues this brings up. And so I've been thinking about how I want to address it in this conversation over the last couple of days. And I think I've got a position for coming at it.
Okay, okay.
So there are, to my mind, there are two sort of things we can mean by the social contract, one of which I don't particularly want to talk about, and one of which I kind of do.
Mm.
One of which is like the sort of the personal social contract where, like, the way that I'll play and I'll act when I'm playing Mike in a game will be very different from the way that I'll act if I go to a tournament and play a total stranger. My language will be a good deal fruitier, for one thing, and I'll assume different things from the person I'm playing with. Um, Separate from that social contract, I think there is another sort of social contract within your game that is about the socially transformative nature of your game. Now, what I think, no, go on.
Okay, so yes, I agree with that taxonomy. I think there's still something more fundamental, which is that ultimately we have already accepted that games themselves are a manufactured magic circle into which we agree to step. And
Mm,
part of that entering of the magic circle is the acceptance of a set of complicated um, sort of intellectual and social rules about what our conduct will be. And
mm,
as you say, that is made more complicated because some of those rules relate to the game at hand, some of those relate to the environment we're playing in, some of those relate to the other players that you're stepping into the magic circle with. But that when we talk about the social contract as game designers, I think we have to be clear that there's this massive depth of that phrase cuts down to, and I think it cuts all the way to the very core of what is playing a game versus not playing a game. And I think entering into the magic circle is achieved via some form of social contract. So I think that's my baseline here, and
mm.
then I think to add some color on the discussion about why I think it matters so much to this podcast and to miniature games is that, Glenn, you and I have talked a number of times about how miniature games in particular, with their fluffy rules and their many objects, they require a level of integration between our acceptance of the magic circle and the rules and playing pieces of the game, which is almost unheard of in any other form of game. There are definitely other examples, and role playing, for example, is a strong example of it. But like, it's a really fluffy game space, and the magic circle can include all kinds of things, and the relationships between those things are not always obvious. And so that's why I think social contract both frames the fundamental nature of a game, but also for miniatures games, it's necessary because the damn things are so slippery on the table.
Yeah, and for me, the so I think that the miniatures games are unusual for a lot of reasons. But one of the reasons I think they're quite unusual is they sit in a midway point of the socially transformative nature of games.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, like, so down one end of the scale, we've got something. I mean, generally board games I think are like on this end of the scale. Not this is an arbitrary scale, but it's going to be on this end of it. And where you've got something like Go or chess would be the sort of ultimate example of I think a very socially transformative game where providing you act by like the most basic level of like acceptable general social behavior when playing a game of Go or chess, then the structures of the game are such that I can have I can have a really good game with a total stranger. um I can have a really good game with somebody that I don't like, that I actively dislike even. And importantly, I think I can have a game with somebody I care about a great deal whilst not caring about like beating them within the game. The structure of the game is such that trying to beat them is the way in which I'm going to be nice to them, because that's how we're going to construct a fun time together.
And perhaps you could add to that list that like you could play that game silently or with someone who didn't speak the same language as you.
Yeah, absolutely. As long as you both understand whatever the end of the rules are, you know, from your end, you don't need to. There is no discussion about, and this is true for many board games. There is no discussion about how certain things move, how they behave.
Mm.
There's like, and this is even like in Monopoly. If I roll a five, there's no it's extremely difficult for me to accidentally move too many or too few spaces on a Monopoly board in a way that, and referring back to Minis games, it's not as it's sort of difficult for me to accidentally move the wrong number of
Yeah,
millimeters
if I have a
or
random
inches.
movement and I roll a five and I might move five and a bit, five slightly less than five. I might move twice because I wasn't sure the first time and end up in quite a different place, like all that.
Yeah. And then like over here on my arbitrary hand-based scale are I think things like RPGs,
Hmm.
which are less sort of socially transformative in, you know, and like, and often oddly, I find in RPGs they're almost the opposite sort of socially transformative way, because they push you into sort of certain social interactions that not only is it hard to get on with somebody that you know, unless you already get on with them in an RPG. Sometimes someone you get on with, generally, you don't get on with them playing an RPG. They're almost like so far down the other end of that particular scale that they're actually, you know, the opposite of being like socially transformative. And what I personally I think is also interesting, I think the minis game sits somewhere in the middle. One of the other things I think is interesting is one of the other ways in which games are very transformative are that they are transformative to a point of view. They give you an option to take a different point of view.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I think is interesting, and I do not think these two axes are related, but there's a heavy correlation, and I'm not sure that they're not related, is that the games down this end of the socially transformative scale aren't tend not to be very transformative of your point of view. If you're playing Go, you're literally a person playing Go. There's really no attempt to ask you to take a transformative point of view. And then you get up through like the Euro games and things that go, yeah, technically you're running a brewery or something, but you're not really pretending to be a brewer running a brewery, through the Ameritrash. And then over here, you've got RPGs, which are saying you are total. The whole point of this is to take a completely transformative viewpoint of the world and try and live a set of experiences through that transformative viewpoint. And
Mm.
I think that those two things are like, you know, separate sets of axes, but there is a hell of a correlation as we go up and down that line. And one of the reasons I think that people, and I come across people who get quite excised sort of in this particular discussion. I think one of the reasons that possibly people get a bit excised is the idea that those two things are on a continuum. Because I think that like what we mean by like narrative minis games are minis games that are very transformative to your viewpoint. And I think that what we mean by competitive minis games is often games that are very socially transformative.
Hmm.
And I think that sometimes, people get sort of quite engaged with this discussion because the idea that a minis game has to be one or the other, that it could not be socially transformative and transformative of a viewpoint. And therefore, if you want it to be both, you're like pushing against the sort of fun that I want to have today. And
Mhm.
that's the sort of thing that gets people sort of quite emotional about this. And that's what I've been thinking about.
Yeah, okay. So I guess one of the ways that maybe I'll ruminate on that is to think about, because you brought it up there, like the ways that we have fun with these games. So as we enter the magic circle, we are personally speaking, we're entering that circle hoping to have the kind of fun that we want to have. And that might be that I take fun from winning. It might be that I take fun from enjoying complex systems. It might be that I have fun from inventing new stories or telling stories about the characters that I've made up. Or it might be that I just have aesthetic fun of the minis and everything. So I step into the circle looking for a kind of fun, and I look across the table and I hope, or I've discussed with you, or I've sort of invited you to share in that same fun, and we may or we may not be entering the circle with the same desires, the same idea of what we're going to get that's good out of the game. So I think that like for me that starts to frame up like what is our job as a games designer to sort of work through this thicket. Is that like a good game is going to at least make a decent stab at kind of bringing those two players to the same field of enjoyment.
Yeah.
The
Uh,
other thing is that um, we've got this we've got this you've got this division between what the game is providing and what just the relationship between the players is providing. And so I think the point I want to make as well, because of the way that you describe that spectrum or those two so nicely, is that individual games can be placed by their designers on different places on the diagram, but they aren't ultimately that's in control of the players. And so it's a contract, it's a discussion between the game and the game maker saying, I think it's this sort of game, and the players who can say, well, no, we're just going to play it in this other way, and that's how we wish to play it. And so I think one of the things that as games designers we're also on the lookout is the sort of the inverse of bringing two players into the same space and having a good time is the like accidental tissue rejection where two players decide to play your game in one way and the game kind of barfs up on them and doesn't work and they don't have fun having their kind of fun with this game and then they walk away going, well, that is either not my kind of game or I don't like it. And so yeah, so I think there's lots of things that we can do with that. But yeah, like
yeah.
I like your philosophical axes, and I suppose that those are my kind of practical intersections with them.
Yeah. And I think personally, I think sometimes like, you say, oh well, people can like decide they're going to play the game in their way, like socially and etc., because they have their own sort of social contract. And I say, yes, absolutely. But equally, they can house rule the rules of the game if they want to. They can play any part of the game in the way that they want to.
That's
I
right.
think as game designers, it's worth thinking that like laying out what sort of social contract is going to be the social contract for your game, what level of socially transformative your game is shooting at being, is not, I think, necessarily constraining your players to playing within those boundaries any more than if you write a rule, your players are helpless to house rule it. Now, some players will feel like pushed in one direction or another by you doing that, but I think that if playing your game with a certain spirit is going to make your game a more enjoyable experience, I think a bit of like guidance or sort of aiming players in a particular direction isn't necessarily the foulest thing that we can possibly do.
No, it's definitely the right. I definitely feel so. Yeah, like shifting gears. I definitely think that like what I do with this understanding that players can approach your game in multiple ways. Players could approach the same game in incongruous ways at the same session, and that people might approach it in one way and find something else. Is that we got to have in our game, literally, or in the presentation of the game, or in the marketing, or in the way that we deliver it, like we've got to figure out ways to communicate this. I was going to say the spirit in which the game is meant to be played, which itself seems to summon up lots of baggage in my mind, but it is genuinely what I mean. Like, what is the game? What kind of experience have you imagined as the designer, and in what sort of ways are you expected to extract fun, and perhaps even like, we don't really have the language for this, but like even describing to players, what sort of fun they are supposed to be extracting. And I think that, you know, um, Joe McCulloch's an easy guy to go to on this because he's so vocal about this in his own rule books. And so, Joe, I think Joe's the sort of designer who has been vocal enough that now the communities around Frostgrave and Rangers of Shadowdeep, like, they understand and communicate with new members of the community that, if you are gonna, if you are going to try and extract the sort of fun that is from, winning all the time and winning in a crunchy, clockworky way, you're less likely to get fun as regularly as if you play in a way that's basically what he says in the book, which is, when you have a rules query, imagine what would happen in the movie and try and get the movie to play out on the table, somewhat in collaboration. And the game itself, Frostgrave, for example, is essentially collaborative. Like, there's no actual inbuilt um conflict. Like, you both want some treasure, but you could just shake hands and take half the treasure each. Like, there isn't
Yeah.
even. And so there, I think he says up front in each of the rule books what he expects, how he expects players to engage with the game, and then is very consistent with that through everything that he communicates. As opposed to what we have talked about before, as opposed to the War Machine, which is also a very effective statement of the way that you should engage with this is you should read the rules, you should understand the rules, you should be a master of the rules should obey you. The game should be won because you know the rules the best, and you should play hard and you should figure out how best to win. And that's fine. It's completely different to Frostgrave, but it's the same in that it's very clearly sets out its stall and says, look, if you're in for this kind of experience, welcome. If you don't want this kind of experience, that might not be the game for you.
Yeah, and I think like increasingly, I think I get like put on edge by the idea of like if you want to play a game to win, being the descriptor of somebody who is looking for a socially transformative game, because I
Yeah.
don't think that's an entire, I think increasingly that's a sort of a quite oppositional way of phrasing it, because it's
Yeah.
like I do think that like what a lot of competitive players, and this is as somebody who has been a hardcore competitive player, wants from a competitive game is to be transformative of the social experience, not necessarily to give like like super hard and fast, crunchy win condition driven play, but
No, it just happens that seeking a crisp victory through exacting play of the rules is the thing that creates that almost elevated state of the social relationship where if you're both playing at that level with that objective, you both have to be playing to win, but you also have to be playing exactly. But then you can also create, as you've talked about before, you can create space and permission to be like, well, we both know the rules. We both know we're trying to play by the rules. I know that that's what you said that you meant to do. And so we'll say that the measurement was correct because we know what we were trying to achieve. And so it can be, so yes, I completely understand. Like, playing to win is a gross oversimplification of what is going on
yeah,
between the two players.
and I think and the place that this sort of thing starts to get me excited is the idea of something that is both very socially transformative and transformative of viewpoint. And
Mm.
like RPGs, now that some RPGs have got a bit more grown up and are dealing with sort of more difficult issues, they've had to come to terms with the fact that RPGs are very non-socially transformative, and that they're building in like session zeros and places and sets of tools for dealing with the fact that essentially when you're playing an RPG, you're still you're you, but being that other person. So when that other person does something particularly foul, it's you doing it in a way that in a socially transformative game it's not. And they've needed to like build these tool sets to say, okay, well, this is where we want to be socially transformative, and this is where we want to allow you to step away, sort of both socially and transformatively from yourself while creating this character, that they are not just, an elf or whatever, but they're a person who does things that you find questionable in very extreme ways. um and it so happens, I think, that a lot of times miniatures games, have followed the sort of the chess path of when they've gone for being like socially transformative. Games like War Machine is a very sort of socially transformative game because it says like, the point here is to use the rules for every possible advantage in
Mm.
order to win the game. And it's like attaching that phrase to chess is like, well, I mean,
Obviously.
who would bother saying that? Who would even bother voicing that with a game of chess or Go? Obviously, even like Monopoly and Cluedo, obviously you are meant to use all the
Right.
rules.
And as you were saying, because miniature games lie, in your view, in the center of this spectrum, like the the fact that War Machine came out and did say that felt unusual. It still feels strange. And when people, if I feel this tension myself, like I, as a designer, I'm constantly trying to figure out what the right balance between serving those players who want to play crunchy and serving those players who wants to play, loose and narratively. Um, and so it's not anywhere near as clear for miniatures games, um, because I think because of a number of reasons, and one of them is that it's at its heart there is an element to miniatures games which are crunchy systems based games, and there is an element to which they are playing with action men and smashing toy cars into each other and just generally kind of engaging in an active playful, it's play in a sort of childish sense as much as it is play in a sort of grown up
Yeah,
analytical sense,
absolutely. And they are this
in
weird.
a way that I just feel chess is not. It doesn't have a childish playfulness to it.
No, I
Stupid chess.
totally. No, but I totally agree, and I do think, and it's one of the things that constantly brings me back to Minis games is the way that they sit weirdly in the middle of a whole bunch of like. It feels like they're constantly in the middle of like all of the extremes of other sorts of games,
Mm.
and it feels like, even though, as we've said on the channel before, they are quite an old form of game, it's barely investigated, like for me, like where they lie on these points, why they lie at one point or another, and how to communicate effectively, and why we don't communicate more effectively to our players where we are on a particular axis of a particular game. Is it because we're embarrassed to say, like, oh well, look, this is a game about winning and being competitive, or this is a game about, basically it's role playing with miniatures. And I think sometimes, I think certainly as a game designer, sometimes I hear both sides of the end of the sort of the discussion, talking in a particular way about the other end of the discussion, that makes me kind of upset, and sometimes makes me feel like I'm a little worried about saying in a game, look, this is what this game is doing. And I think it's a real pity, because I think most people, apart from the absolute extremes, are willing to engage with something like more towards the middle or more towards the other end.
or
If
or, or different dishes from different games at different times with different friends.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And but I really think that people are willing, if you put a hand out to them and you say, look, this is what we're trying to do here today. This is how you'll be able to have fun with it if you engage with it in this spirit. I think people will go like, well, I'll give it a go, and I'll see. And I think you massively increase the probability of them enjoying themselves, as opposed to giving them this thing that like will fall apart if they try to be super competitive, or will not reward them if they try to play in a, oh well, I don't think this is what my guy would do, I think he would do this instead, kind of viewpoint. And I think that you just have much more success. And I think there's a great value to stop and, at some point, like towards the start of the rules, and go, look, guys, this is what we're trying to do here. This is the place I'm trying to put you in. This is the mindset that will be more rewarding. And it doesn't mean that my like rules are like weak or loose or cold-hearted or whatever the pejorative you have of the bit of the spectrum you don't enjoy playing. It's just saying this is how you have fun with my fun stick, and try and do that, and it will be better for you and more rewarding.
And I think that for me, there's a challenging part here, which is how how like how specific do you make your game? Because we want to make our games specific enough in their target audience that they land nicely with an actual player base, rather than being sort of, weak lemon squash that no one really enjoys, but it's fine for everyone. But at the same time, you will end up interacting with players who have got, all kinds of different things that they're trying to extract from our game. And I suppose for me, like, there's a couple things. One is, I want to be, as a designer, really cautious about like how I play versus the sort of games that I design. And am I making sure that I design games that I understand because they're the kinds of games I play, versus and also, like, am I making sure that I'm pushing myself as a designer to both play in different ways and design in different ways, so that I'm not always, the guy that makes the hard bitten economic simulator war game and there's no other setting that I'm on. And then the other is that I think both of us are trying to say in different ways, like, we would like to find a way to heal any schism between, the so-called narrative gamers and the so-called competitive gamers, because all of us are trying to do is step into a consistent magic circle with another person who shares the same kind of values about what to get out of the game, and hope that we've brought the right game, we've stepped into the right magic circle at the right time with the right players. And so everything that we can do to help each other understand through our game design, through our rules text, through the communication, and through the communities as well, that, it's not they're not two different ways to play games. They are just a spectrum of different ways to enjoy different games, and some games will function better at one end of that continuum or another. And yeah, so I think, like, that for me is also, it's also really important, because I don't feel I feel very moderate in this debate, because I play with certain friends of ours. I play in very loosey goosey narrative ways, where sometimes we throw rules away if they don't fit the story that's unfolding, and in other places I'll play, deliberately to the letter, zero house rules stuff, because I want to absolutely enjoy the purest experience of that game, partly because I'm a practitioner and a scientist of these things, and I want to experience it. So I'm also conscious that, like, I don't wish to pick a side. I don't pick a side. I play both sides. And I also feel that as game designers, we ought to be careful both to communicate what side we're trying to speak to, but also to not further division and schism.
Indeed, indeed. And if you have maybe played a game that you feel tempted you across the divide of whichever part of the schism you are lying on, I would love to know which game tempted you across, how it laid out the bits of the social contract that made it work for you, even though that it wasn't going to work in the way that you naturally play a game. And so, in order to help me discover that, I'd love you to swing down to the comments section and type in there which game it was, and where it brought you from and where it pulled you to.
I'd also like to hear what people think are games that they think they're playing deliberately in the wrong way. So are you playing Narrative War Machine, or are you playing, like, you guys having Frostgrave tournaments on the regular?
Absolutely. And if you're swinging through to the comments section, like on the way down, like just below this and just above that, there are some buttons, a like and subscribe button. Press those as you
Important buttons, very important buttons.
very, very important splendid buttons. And also just above the comment section, there's a set of links. And one of the links is over to our Discord, where you can have this chat and talk to other people who are probably willfully playing games wrongly. And also there is a link to a Patreon, which is Mike's Patreon. And if you swing by there and give him some money, he will put up hacks and rules of games that he's played so wrongly that they needed rewriting, and you can have those and enjoy them.
That's
and
a perfectly good way to start any game design, Glenn, you well know.
And then you can play Mike's games wrongly as well, and you can tell him about it, and it will be delicious. But for now, and from this episode of Rule of Carnage, I think that'll be a thank you, goodbye. So thank you, goodbye. Bye, 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 bye.
Bye-bye.